In 1749, one of the most significant events in the spread of the gospel over the past 3 centuries occurred. It was the publication of a book. Books matter. And this book was entitled The Life of David Brainerd. Countless missionaries, including Henry Martin and William Carey and Robert Murray McCheyne and Jim Elliot, were all inspired to the mission field because they read this book, because they pondered this book, because God called them through the context of reading that book. Now, that particular book had a remarkable origin because it was written by none other than Jonathan Edwards. Pastor theologian Jonathan Edwards, one of the greatest theological minds that America has ever produced, and some would say that the world has ever produced. Jonathan Edwards had befriended David Brainerd. And when David Brainerd contracted tuberculosis while serving in ministry to the American Indians, Edwards brought David Brainerd into his home to recuperate. But David Brainerd did not recover. And on October 9th of 1747, David Brainerd passed from this earth, leaving all of his earthly possessions in the care of Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards, well, among David Brainerd's personal possessions was his diaries. And Edwards read his diaries. And Jonathan Edwards was captivated by the sincere, intelligent, authentic faith of this young man and the compelling godliness of this young man. And Jonathan Edwards felt a mandate to preserve his story, to apply Hebrews chapter 13 so the outcome of Brainerd's way of life and his faith would be imitated by others, as it could be seen in the context of this book. And so he published a book entitled The Life of David Brainerd, and this small volume was to become the most widely read and reprinted of all of Jonathan Edwards' works over the next 100 years. Now, here's the irony of that. Were it not for a single, most devastating failure of Brainerd's life, David Brainerd would have never gone to the American Indians. David Brainerd would have never had a book published about his life, and scores of missionaries, presumably, would have remained on the sidelines, were it not for the single, most devastating failure of his life. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a dream so captivating that you are willing to lose sleep, you are willing to make sacrifices, you are willing to impose serious disciplines upon your life just to see it come about? Have you ever had an aspiration for the future that just seems to reach into the present and grab a hold of you like a tractor beam that's drawing you into the future? David Brainerd's consuming desire was to be a pastor. He wanted to preach. He felt called to care for God's people. He wanted to assume responsibility within the church. Now, that's a goal that you may not be able to relate to, but my question to you is, in order to make it relate, is have you ever had a dream? Have you ever had a goal or a desire that drove you, that compelled you, that you looked at, that you focused on, that you wanted because you felt God had called you to go after it? Well, then I think you can relate to this story. But to be a pastor, at least at that period of American history, you were required to have a university degree. And so David Brainerd enrolled in Yale, and he moved to go to school there. Now, David Brainerd, well, to say he was a bright guy would be an understatement. David Brainerd was on the fast track. He was bright, he was articulate, he was well-liked by the other students. In fact, Yale was about to graduate the largest class ever in their history, and Brainerd was at the very top of the class. Now, can you just imagine the prestige associated with that position? Could you imagine the mental firepower that he possessed in order to obtain it? But like all of us, David Brainerd's tongue was not as smart as his brain, because as Jonathan Edwards reported it, quote, Brainerd had the unhappiness to have a tincture of that intemperate, indiscreet zeal. Well, just in case you don't know what he's saying there, that's Edwards' way of saying he had a big mouth and he knew how to use it. And so this is what happened. The Great Awakening was breaking out all over New England, and it was turning Yale upside down. Edwards had just been in to preach at Yale. The Spirit of God was being poured out. The students were being stoked and excited by what God was doing in their midst. However, not all the faculty shared the enthusiasm of the students. And there was a professor, one Chauncey Whittlesey, who didn't support the move of the Spirit. And Brainerd did not approve of him. And so one day, David Brainerd boldly announced to two friends that he was talking to that Whittlesey, quote, had no more grace than this chair. And he went on to say that he wondered that the man didn't, quote, drop down dead right where he's standing for his lack of support of the awakening. Now, you can almost hear the youthful arrogance in his statement. You can almost hear the immature indiscretion behind his words. Well, the problem was somebody did hear. And he was reported to the administration, and David Brainerd was immediately expelled. Now, just stop for a second and ponder that. He's at the top of his class at the best school in the nation. He is the valedictorian. He is only months away from fulfilling his life dream. He had his choice of any pulpit in the country, at least the country as it was formed at that point in history, and he was expelled. He was disgraced. He had failed. How do you recover from that? How do you relate to that? How does one resolve that? Last summer, we just concluded a service where I met a guy after the service. I'll call him Stu. And Stu posed the following question to me. He said, Dave, what do I do when my ambitions set me up to fail? And I was looking at him, and I immediately thought, man, why do I always get these questions? Go talk to Jared. No. I said, tell me your story. And so Stu began to relate to me that he had graduated from college and that his desire, his dream was to achieve sufficient wealth to be able to then go part-time into serving the Lord in some kind of ministry. And his dream was coming true. He became successful in his role. He began to work within a church, and they offered him a position. And it just seemed for him like it was some kind of Christian novel that was coming to life, that it was going to happen for him happily ever after. But then in a series of corporate maneuvers, his boss moved on, the demands of his job changed, and he had difficulty under the new administration, and he was eventually fired. Now listen, here's my question. How do you help a guy who concludes that his life dreams for glorifying God have resulted in failure? How do you help a guy or a woman in that place? That's Brainerd. That's what happened to him. That's right where he is. And it may be that it's right where some of you are as well. And here's the thing I want to take you to. Here's the thing I want to point out. In fact, it's going to be the singular point of the message and one I'm going to return to frequently. And it's this, that failure is often ambition refused for a better plan. Failure is often ambition refused for a better plan. And I want to explore that in three different ways and explore how Brainerd's failure resulted in God's better plan, and that we might apply then Hebrews 13 to consider the outcome of his way of life and imitate his faith.